everyone. You're very welcome to this evening's webinar entitled 93 Years of UN Resolution 194, the closing panel, which is the final event of the Palestinian Return Centre's second annual Return Week, which seeks to mobilize Palestinians and their allies around the world to call for and support the Palestinian right to return. Today's event is an online panel discussion where we'll be hearing from Miko Peled Terry Rempel and Salman Abu Sitta. Before introducing the speakers, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about My Return campaign. The My Return campaign is a popular voluntary initiative launched by the London-based Palestinian Return Centre in cooperation with national and international pro-Palestine partners. The campaign was first launched in Jordan in cooperation with Palestine Committee in the Jordanian Parliament. The campaign culminates in a petition that calls for and reaffirms the Palestinian right to return. The campaign seeks to turn such an inalienable right into an international cause. The campaign seeks to garner the largest possible number of signatures in a petition confirming Palestinian refugees' devotion to their right to return. The petition clearly states that it rejects the US so called deal of the century and any other initiative undermining Palestinians' internationally guaranteed rights. Israel and the US have never ceased to undermine such an inalienable Palestinian right by denying the refugee status of displaced Palestinians inside and outside the occupied Palestine. The former US President Donald Trump's recognition of occupied Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the campaign waged by Israel and the US against the UN Relief and Work Agency for Palestine refugees, the US suspension of its funding to Palestinian refugees, and the increasing calls to resettle the refugees in destinations other than Palestine are tactics which, though seemingly divergent, aim for the same goal to undermine the right to return. The right to return will never be negotiated away or used as a bargaining chip. The campaign is based on individual signatures on My Return petition through its official website, www.myreturn.net. The petition has already garnered over 1 million signatures, and we'd ask that you please add your name to this growing list if you haven't already done so. Before introducing our speakers, just to say if you have any questions you would like to pose to the speakers this evening, please do leave them in the comment section and the speakers will answer them in the question and answer section at the end of the last speaker. So I'm very excited to introduce Miko Peled. Miko Peled is a writer and human rights activist born and raised in Jerusalem. He is considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine, support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divest, and sanctions of Israel, the BDS movement, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights on all of historic Palestine. He is the author of The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Over to you, Miko.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this excellent initiative, in this excellent program. And I'm honored to be on the panel with such distinguished guests. So thank you for all of that. I don't think one can overemphasize the importance of this event, of commemorating Resolution 194 and reminding the world that this resolution exists, that it is relevant, and that the right of return shall not and could not and must not ever be negotiated under any circumstances. I think the right of the Palestinians to return must be implemented unconditionally, as quickly as possible. And again, like I said, under no circumstances should it be negotiated away, nor should there be any conditions placed upon it. The problem, of course, that we face as we look at the world around us in a realistic way is that through the enormous efforts of the Zionist movement around the world, the different tentacles of the Zionist movement, if you will, around the world, and the compliance of the Western governments, particularly the United States and the UK, it's very rare to hear anybody speak about the right of return and Resolution 194 in a serious way. I would guess that most of you, certainly the panelists, know about the book Palestinian Refugees in International Law, which I believe came out in the second edition about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. I featured the authors in one of my podcasts and one of my webinars last year. And this book, I think, is a crucial part of the education that we owe to ourselves as human beings, certainly as people who care for justice and freedom in Palestine, to really understand the depth of Resolution 194, the depth of the issue of the return of the refugees, and to understand just how strong the case is for the refugees' right to return. It is becoming stronger with time, not weaker, as some people would have us believe. Resolution 194 is an incredibly important, monumental resolution, maybe one of the most important, certainly on the issue of refugees, ever passed in the United Nations. And it is incumbent upon all of us to talk about it and to demand that it is be brought back, or be brought to become, front and center in the discourse on Palestine. I was speaking to some. I live in Washington D.C., and of course, in Washington D.C., there is no Palestinian presence. The last remnant of some presence was the PLO office, which Donald Trump closed and kicked out the representatives. But of course, that office represented the Palestinian Authority, and really the right of return, Resolution 194, and many of the other important issues, crucial issues to Palestine, were never raised and could not be raised by this office. And the organizations that do exist here in Washington, D.C., and really throughout the U.S., refrain from bringing it up for fear of losing funding, for fear of losing access to Congress, for fear of hurting somebody's feelings, and so on. And it's a very, very serious, I think, problem that I think needs to be addressed. If nobody demands that this issue be raised, if nobody demands that the Resolution 194 be implemented, that the right of return be implemented, then it won't be. And certainly, I believe that if it is not raised in Washington, D.C., and in London and other capitals, then certainly Palestinians on their own are not going to be able to bring it to materialize. I think that the process that we've seen over the years, obviously, is the marginalization of the resolution and trying to marginalize the right of return, trying to marginalize the reality in which Palestinian refugees live throughout Palestine and also throughout the countries bordering Palestine. And once again, this is a reality that we need to do everything we can, everything in our power as people of conscience, as people who believe in justice, and certainly as people who care for Palestine, in order to bring it back into the discourse. First of all, why are these people not allowed to return? Why are these people who yearn so much to return and who are, without any doubt, going to contribute to the well-being of Palestine, to everything that has to do with progress and life in Palestine? Why are they being denied the right to return, knowing full well that in many cases, even when they live outside of Palestine, they're only living maybe an hour, 2 hours drive from Palestine, or maybe a short flight. So why is this the reality? Why is this acceptable? Why are Palestinian refugees being treated differently than other refugees around the world? And of course, I think as we ask these questions, people realize the only reason this is the reality is because Israel has created a political environment where you cannot touch the subject, you cannot broach it, you cannot demand it. And again, there's this fear among organizations here in the United States and certainly in Washington, D.C., that if they bring it up, all the few doors that are open to them to discuss some issues in regards to Palestine, even those doors would be closed. Um, so again, it's this strange, catch-22 in a way. If we don't bring it up, it's never going to be brought up. And so the people who need to discuss it, members of Congress, the press, and indeed anybody who deals with issues of human rights, if they don't bring it up, it's never going to be brought up, but it's never being brought up because they're afraid that they won't have access if they do bring it up. My personal opinion is that it must be brought back front and center here in Washington, D.C. and London and other capitals, and that a clear demand must be made to the people who are in power, to elected officials, elected representatives, and so on, to come back and discuss the right of return, to come back and discuss Resolution 194. Now, another interesting book, I think, that is important that relates to this in many ways, besides, of course, the wonderful atlas that Dr. Salman has provided all of us, is Nur Masalha's book, Palestine, a 4,000-Year History. In other words, if there's any doubt that Palestine had a glorious history, if there's any doubt that Palestine, the different localities within Palestine, not only existed, but existed until relatively recently, and if there's any doubt that there's a process of destruction, ethnic cleansing, and genocide taking place in Palestine, and being being executed by Israel and by the various Zionist groups around the world, then read these books, take a look at the atlas, take a look at the real history of Palestine. I think this connection is important because the propaganda, the Zionist propaganda, is all about erasing Palestine. So there was this wonderful history. There was a country that was populated. There was these towns and cities and villages and so forth. There was an industry and an economy and a social and political life that were brought to a halt in May of 1948. And from that moment on, all of that became nothing but a historical footnote. And the only history that exists, the only history that is discussed when we talk about Palestine is the biblical narrative, which of course is not a history, and the Zionist narrative of return. And really nothing of significance ever happened between those two, in the 2,000 years or so that lapsed between those two. And therefore the refugees are really not a problem. I think it's crucially important to connect the reality of Palestine with its past, with its history, with its geography, a recognition, which something, by the way, the organization Zochrot does wonderfully, remembering the towns and villages that were destroyed, and recalling their memories and writing about them and giving tours and so on and so forth. If this is not brought back, then suddenly the connection of Resolution 194, of the refugees, to this history is this, that's the disconnect. Unless we bring back the history, unless we bring back the story, unless we make sure that people are familiar with the atlas, and they're familiar with the history, then the refugees doesn't seem like they are part of this. And I believe that one of the reasons that the refugees are still refugees, one of the reasons that Israel and the Zionists insist on not allowing this, not only not allowing them to return, but not allowing the discussion to take place, not allowing this issue to be part of the discourse, is that they want to maintain this disconnect between the history of Palestine and what is happening in Palestine today, and pretend that the only history that is relevant is, again, the Zionist narrative. So and the way I see it today, it's not going to happen on its own. We, as people of conscience, the people we talk to, the people we know, the people around us, we need to organize and mobilize in a way that brings this back into the discourse. We must demand that this is part of the discourse. We must demand, here in the United States, there are all these Zionist organizations that make sure that public school curricula do not include anything that they do not approve in relation to Palestine. We need to be there to make sure that the way that Palestine is taught, the true real history of Palestine is taught as it actually was. That the maps, the maps, the pre-1948 maps are taught, that people are familiar with them, that the history is taught, that people are familiar with history. Many people, even Palestinians, many Palestinians have never heard of Dahir Omar and the great things that happened throughout Palestine throughout the 18th, 19th century as a result of his work, as a result of his leadership. And again, this is all part of this enormous gap that exists in the discourse because, of course, of the Israeli propaganda and the strength of the Zionist organizations in the capitals around the world. What I'm trying to do here in DC, in Washington, DC, and I'll end with this, is to try to ignite this conversation, is to try to create some kind of a center here in Washington, D.C. that is not beholden to the Zionists, is not beholden to NGO money, and can talk and bring this back front and center. Right of return, Resolution 194, and the other crucial issues that are kept off the out of the discourse, the rights of the Palestinians and the right of Palestine to go back and be Palestine, even though it's not going to be exactly the same, but to recognize what was there, to recognize what is happening today, and then build this future that Palestinians deserve, which, by the way, will be good for everybody who lives in Palestine. So that's what that's the focus that I believe that's the focus. That's something that I'm trying to do here in Washington, D.C., is to raise that awareness, and again, to create some kind of a center here that pushes this forward and brings it back into the discourse. So thank you very much, and I'll end here.
Brilliant, Miko. Thank you so much for those insights, and really that appeal of what part that we can all play on putting this front and center of the agenda moving forward. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, Terry Rempel. Terry Rempel is a Canadian-based independent scholar currently residing on Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous people, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dean, Ojibwe, Satu, Anish, and Inbai, Inuit, and my apologies for any mispronunciation that I give there to the Indigenous people. A graduate of the University of Exeter, Rempel holds a doctorate in philosophy with a specialization in Middle East politics and was a founding member of the Badai Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugees' Rights in Palestine. His current research projects includes a resurvey of the Palestinian refugee problem over the longue durée of the dual perspective of settler colonialism and ethno-religious nationalism. You're very welcome, Terry. Over to you. Okay, apologies. We seem to be having difficulties connecting with Terry. I wasn't sure if it was my internet or on Terry's end, but I presume it's his. Okay, we'll move on to our third speaker, and we'll go back to Terry if he's able to rejoin. Um, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Salman Abu Sitta. Salman Abu Sitta was born in 37 in the Beersheba district of Mandia, Palestine. An engineer by profession and a researcher most known for his groundbreaking project mapping of Palestine in the 21st, 20th, and 19th centuries, and developing a practical plan for implementing the Palestinian right to return of Palestinian refugees. He has spent over 40 years digging for any detail of information about or related to Palestine before, during, and after the Al Nakba. Abdul Sateh's work has encompassed not only documenting the Nakba but also ensuring that the memories and identity of the occupied homeland are never lost. He is the author of 6 books and over 300 articles and papers on Palestine, including the Atlas of Palestine 1917 to 1966. He is the founder and president of the Palestine Land Society. Dr. Salma, over to you.
Thank you, Michaela, and greetings to my friend Terry. I hope he comes back on screen again. And hello to Miko. I hope to make acquaintance face to face sometime. Thank you, PRC, for the invitation. I come loaded with lots of ideas. I just came back from Gaza Strip after some 50 years of absence. And that is, as you know, where 2 million Palestinians seeking refuge from the Zionist invasion of Palestine since 1948. Before 1948, they lived in 240 villages in the southern half of Palestine, about 50%. And they lived there until 1948, until they were attacked and expelled by the Haganah to Gaza Strip. Now, Gaza Strip is only 1.3% of Palestine. So if you lived in 50% of Palestine, you are pushed into 1.3% of Palestine. And that's what we call concentration camp. The Haganah couldn't have done that except through series of massacres in 1948. But that was not an event in 1948. It continues nonstop till today, 73 years later. This is the biggest, longest serving concentration camp in the world today. Gaza is besieged by land, sea, and air. Gantz, the war criminal general, who is boasting about killing Palestinians, proudly claimed this week that he completed building a fence around Gaza, 60 feet high above ground and 60 feet below ground. And during my visit, I frequently woke up 3 o'clock in the morning at the hum of drones above my head. It's constant, day and night, watching us, monitoring us, ready to resume attack at any time. In last May attack, an Israeli call came to anybody in a house, leave your house in 10 minutes or we will kill you. And they did. They pick up any building and blow it up. They even blow up an apartment, selected apartment in a building. It's like fishing for a fish in an aquarium. Why is that? Why is that? Why did those settlers from East Europe come and attack us so ferociously, so constantly, for so long, while the so-called civilized world is watching? Let us remember this. Gaza's story, and indeed the rest of Palestine's in 1948, shall remain the indelible black page in Jewish history. This is a fact which will be recorded all along. Gaza is the stuff from which the right of return is made. I toured the area along the barbed wire circling the Gaza Strip. I saw mounds of Israeli snipers' nests. I saw the places where the young people, 3rd or 4th generation refugees, shouting across the barbed wire, "We shall return." They were mowed by Israeli machine guns. But they did not retreat. One of them climbed the fence and shot the sniper in the face. Yes, indeed. This is the stuff from which the right of return is made. They could return just by walking. It's only a few meters away. They do not need ships or planes. They can see their homes across the barbed wire. They live in Gaza Strip at a density of population of 7,000 persons per square kilometer. Who lives in their homes? East European settlers at a density of only 7 persons per square kilometer, 1,000 times less. All the kibbutzim in southern Palestine, 230 of them, occupying half of Palestine, are less in population than Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. Let us remember that. Of course, this brings up again the cardinal principle: the right of return is sacred, legal, possible, and inevitable. Of course, it's sacred because it is in the heart of the mind of every Palestinian. It is legal in every line of international law and in principles of justice. Only recently, in Myanmar case, the ICC held that denial of the right of return is a war crime. It is possible, as we have demonstrated in our studies many times before, but let me now recapitulate. We examined the village lands of rural villages who are the bulk of refugees. We know their land boundaries, we know the owners of the land, we know in which refugee camp they live today. We also know who lives on their land today. We found that 246 village lands have no Jews today. We also found that 272 village lands have much less than 5,000 Jews in each of them. The southern district is almost empty. Where do Jews in Israel live today? On the books, they list 924 localities, but that's misleading. Most of these are like sentries, preventing Palestinians from return. The majority of Jews, 87%, live in 55 localities. That is 5% of all localities listed. The net land they occupy is 1,400 square kilometers, or 6% of Israel's area. They concentrate in 3 cantons: Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Haifa, and West Jerusalem. This simple demographic fact is very clear to realize or to prove. Therefore, the conclusion from that is that most refugees can return home without major displacement of Jews. But we go further than theorizing. We have database which shows the pattern of return from each camp to each village, which road it follows, and how long it takes. When they arrive, they will find their homes destroyed. Every year, we have teams of young Palestinian architectural students compete in the reconstruction of a list of refugees, of a list of villages destroyed. The British architectural jury who judge their work are amazed at their creativity. Last year, young architects in Gaza designed the reconstruction of Suhmata in Galilee. Suhmata people living in refugee camps in Lebanon, watched this design in amazement and hope. But let us be clear. No one is naive enough to think that could happen easily. It requires, first and foremost, abolishing Zionism, lock, stock, and barrel. Zionism must be abolished with all its luggage, war crimes, apartheid, occupation, just like all evils which have been relieved from the world in the last 100 years. But could this happen? On the positive side, in 2030, there will be 18 million Palestinians. Half of them will be on Palestine soil. The Palestinians have no intention to go away. They will stay around forever as before. And the young did not forget and will not forget. Just watch the youth in Gaza, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Al-Lid, in Haifa, in Jerusalem last May. Just watch the young Palestinians in every city in Europe, USA, as far as Chile and New Zealand. Also, just watch the young American Jews. At least 1/3 of my audience in American universities are Jews. They came, they asked questions, they have been misled for so long. Some months ago, I exchanged many emails with Peter Bernard, the popular young American Jew. He was inquiring about the right of return and how it could be implemented. There are many like him. Of course, we have a hero with us today, Miko Peled. The wall of silence, therefore, about Al-Nakba, erected by the Zionist machine, is slowly cracked. A picture from a survivor's mobile in Gaza, standing on the heap of his ruined house, speaks volumes. But of course, sadly, this is not enough. On the negative side, there are many enemies. You have the Western colonial structure, headed by the US, Britain, Germany, and all the rest of Europe, who stand by Israel at the cost of Palestinian blood. This week, there was a reminder. Ismail Ziada, a Dutch citizen, lost his family in 2014 attack during Israeli bombardment. He sued General Gantz, the war criminal, at Dutch courts, and the court gave him immunity. Then you have some Arab rulers who turned willing Israeli allies. All of those have no democracy. If they did, their people would no doubt topple them the next morning. Finally, you have the hardcore financial, military, industrial complex in and outside Israel. It's connected with the centers of power in the West. They will wage a bloody war to survive. They are ready to drop nuclear bombs. But where will they drop it? That's the question. In this war, the Mizrahi, the Hardim, the Russian immigrants will be swept away by the wayside as cannon fodder. That is the sad situation. But let us remain optimistic. Let us heed lessons from Gaza. In Gaza, if Gaza survived for 73 years, so will Palestine. If Gaza multiplied 10 times since 1948, so will Palestine. There is no denying the fact. Right of return is sacred, legal, possible, and inevitable. And so it will come. Justice will prevail. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Salman. That it was very inspiring and uplifting. Sacred, legal, possible, and inevitable. A very empowering message to hold on to this evening. Thank you. We're going to try and reconnect now with Terry. Can you hear us okay, Terry?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Great.
Perfect. I hope this works. Good. Thank you. Sorry for the technical issues. First things first, I would like to thank the Return Center for the invitation. I'm honored to share some reflections on the right of return, in particular paragraph 11 of Resolution 194, in the company of my co-panelists and the many others who are joining us for this closing panel of Return Week. As many, if not probably most of you well know, Resolution 194, which was adopted 73 years ago tomorrow, resolves that refugees displaced during the 1948 war in Palestine who wish to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practical date. For some time as a researcher, and with also wearing an activist hat, I've wondered why paragraph 11 does not refer explicitly to the right to return, quote unquote. It's a term and a phrase the UN mediator on Palestine, Count Bernadotte, used extensively in his September 1948 report. And it was his report which comprised the basis for General Assembly Resolution 194. The absence of an explicit reference to the right to return has also struck me as curious in light of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 73rd anniversary coincidentally is being commemorated right now. And especially in light of the fact that inclusion of the right to return in Article 14 of the Declaration stemmed from a Lebanese amendment tabled in October 1948 with Palestinian refugees apparently in mind. That's only one example of several, including the Genocide Convention and the Refugee Convention, in which the 1948 Palestine intersected with the development of international law after the Second World War. The absence of this term phrase, moreover, is one of several arguments which many opponents of the right to return frequently make to support the claim that Resolution 194 does not affirm such a right. With that background in mind, I'd like to summarize the conclusion of, and then offer a critical reflection on some of my recent research into the drafting history of paragraph 11. The focus of the first part is more legal and probably somewhat nerdy, but more importantly, the findings of that legal research are unlikely to change the minds and hearts of those already opposed to the right to return. As we all know, the problem merely lay in clarifying the meaning of the 73-year-old resolution. The refugees would return to their homes, villages, and towns in Palestine a long time ago. Which is why I'd like to offer a more recent and critical, more political, and evolving reflection on my initial findings, which may offer a rounded insight on bridging the gap between principle and practice of return. Finally, it's important to note that the refugee issue received relatively little coverage during the drafting process of Resolution 194. The primary focus was on territorial and procedural issues relating to what the UN referred to as the peaceful adjustment of the situation in Palestine. While these latter issues and the broader context in which Resolution 194, regionally and globally, in which the resolution was drafted, are important in understanding the final wording of paragraph 11 on the right to return, my remarks will be limited for reasons of time simply to tracing the evolution in the first part of language on the right to return. So the drafting history of paragraph 11 can be divided into four different, though somewhat overlapping phases. Many of you are likely familiar with the suggestions and specific conclusions on refugees drafted by the UN mediator during the first phase, which began in June 1948 and ended several months later in September. As already noted, Bernadotte referred to the right to return extensively in his reports and in his communications. The mediator's specific conclusion on the right to return was subsequently incorporated into a relatively unknown draft resolution written by Alf Bunch, who was Bernadotte's principal advisor, who became the acting mediator after Bernadotte's assassination by Zionist terrorists. This was during the second phase, Bunch's resolution, which began in late September and lasted until mid-October, when discussion of the mediator's September report in the General Assembly's first political committee began. Initial drafts prepared by the British and the Americans in late September and early October, that is to say before the Bunch draft, had emphasized that the refugees shall be entitled to return. Consultations with British and American officials, however, led to the inclusion of Bunch's language on the right to return in subsequent composite Anglo-American drafts of what would become eventually Resolution 194. When the First Committee's discussions of Bernadotte's report finally began during the third week of November, after the collapse of the Second Truce in Palestine, however, the British decided to table their own draft resolution. This was because of unresolved differences with the Americans on territorial and procedural elements, which prevented the submission of a joint sponsored resolution. This marked the beginning of the third phase, which lasted until early December. Critically, in contrast to the Anglo-American drafts, which included Bunch's language on the right to return, the British text appeared to shift emphasis by focusing on Israel's obligation, stating that the General Assembly resolved language that would end up in the final version of paragraph 11, that refugees should be permitted to return. Equally significant, the British added a preamble to the paragraph on refugees, which referred to that part of the mediator's report, which affirmed Israel's obligation for both restitution of private property and compensation of property wantonly destroyed. Now, to make a long story short, as part of a series of Anglo-American compromises during the third phase, the British agreed to change the above preamble, referring instead to the mediator's specific condition, which recommended that the UN should affirm the right of the refugees to return to their homes at the earliest possible date. Thus, at the end of the drafting process in the first committee in early December, the language of the draft resolution on the right to return remained consistent with the mediator's report, albeit indirectly through reference to that report in the preamble, paragraph 11. Interestingly, as the American officials reported that their Israeli counterparts appeared to be alarmed that the draft resolution, which resolved, as I said, that refugees wishing to return and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so, language that was almost identical to that found in the final version of Resolution 194, paragraph 11, except for a small shift in the word possible to practicable. The Israeli officials noted that, with alarm, apparently, this still established the principle of absolute and unrestricted return. Of course, by May of the following year in 1949, during hearings that would lead to Israel's entry into the UN as a member state, this position had already begun to change, and indeed, by the end of the year, this was no longer the position held in terms of the interpretation of paragraph 11. Significant unresolved differences about general principles among the members of the First Committee threatened to sink the draft resolution when it came up for a vote in the General Assembly's plenary session on December 11th. In a nutshell, member states continued to knock heads about whether the partition plan or the mediator's report should comprise the framework for a peaceful adjustment to the situation in Palestine. Thus, on December 11th, a group of 7 states tabled a final amendment that led to the scrubbing of all references of Resolution 181 and the mediator's report from Resolution 194. Critically, and this helps explain what happened to the mediator's language on the right to return, this resulted in the deletion of the preamble to paragraph 11 on refugees, which referred back to Bernadotte's specific conclusion on the right to return. As the sponsors of the amendment explained, however, this did not change the meaning of paragraph 11, since the content of the preamble was redundant in terms of the rest of paragraph 11. To summarize then, a close reading of the drafting history suggests that explicit reference to the term and phrase right to return is absent from paragraph 11, not because states believe that refugees did not have a right to return. Indeed, throughout the drafting process, continue referred to the right of return. Rather, it is absent simply as a result of political compromises on larger issues among the drafters that had nothing to do with the return of refugees to their homes. Moving on then, in this remaining time, I'd like to switch gears by focusing on two additional insights from the drafting history of paragraph 11, which seem to offer a more political interpretation of Resolution 194. So the first insight is from the Bunch draft. In line with the mediator's September 1948 report, the acting mediator's draft resolution declared that within the respective political entities in Palestine, Arabs and Jews shall enjoy equal political, economic, social, and religious rights. Notably, this did not include an Arab Palestinian state. By this time, the British and Americans had already decided that a Palestinian state, even the minimalist one provided for in the UN partition plan, was no longer viable. And it was Bunch who was responsible for removal of Bernadotte's recommendation from Resolution 194, under which the future of the partitioned Arab state would be decided through consultation among Arab leaders and indigenous inhabitants of the relevant territories. It was the British, however, who recommended that Bunch's provision on equality be deleted from the resolution during the third phase of the drafting process. The Foreign Office essentially argued that the provision would be difficult to enforce. Interestingly, the General Assembly agreed to reinsert a similar provision 2 years later in Resolution 194 on Palestinian refugees. Now, I find this rarely mentioned aspect of Resolution 194's drafting history illuminating for several reasons. First, it needs to be remembered that what the General Assembly had endorsed in Resolution 181 and was being asked to reaffirm through the Bunch draft was equality and respect of individual and minority rights. This was not an endorsement of equality with respect to the collective right of peoples to determine their own future. If that had been the case, Palestine should have become an independent state based on the wishes of the majority of the country's indigenous inhabitants. To understand the UN partition plan simply as an attempt to reconcile two irreconcilable national movements necessarily entails, to put it another way, the indigenization of Zionist settlers and the erasure of settler colonialism. But in my reading of Resolution 194, the General Assembly appeared to go one step further. Admittedly, the motives and interests of member states who voted for the resolution were complex and varied. Nevertheless, what the resolution seemed to ask Palestinians to do was to give up their history and their claims as a people in exchange for becoming individual members of the liberal order. Equally significant, by making Israel's existence a starting point for a peaceful adjustment of the situation in Palestine, and by removing the international guarantee at the British behest that the Jewish state respect the fundamental principle of equality, the General Assembly not only appeared to grant de facto recognition to Israel well before its acceptance as a member state in the United Nations, the Assembly also appeared to turn a blind eye and enable the state to preserve its settler colonial structure. The second thing which needs to be remembered in relation to the British recommendation to remove respect for the principle of equality from Resolution 194 is that in the years that followed the Second World War, the British were among the leading proponents of so-called colonial exemption clauses, which essentially aimed to exempt imperial powers from the obligation to apply the emerging canon of international law in the colonial world. This may provide a more complete understanding as to why the Foreign Office recommended the removal of Bunch's language on equality. But what I find more interesting is how a narrowly construed legal interpretation of paragraph 11 of Resolution 194 may unintentionally harbor a tendency to obfuscate race and its underlying structures. The second insight that I'd like to share from a series of interventions by Palestinian and Arab representatives during the third phase of the drafting process is from the third phase of the drafting process in the General Assembly's first committee. In their view, paragraph 11, which resolved the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors, was acceptable, but still vastly insufficient. In order to understand why, allow me to briefly quote Ahmed Shukairi and Henry Katan, both of whom spoke on behalf of the Arab Higher Committee. To begin with Ahmed Shukairi, partition was based on the idea that Palestine could be dissected as if it were a corpse. But as Palestine was a living organism, and as all the partition plans made to date included either a majority of Arabs or equal number of Arabs and Jews within the so-called Jewish state, the Zionists had tried to turn the Arabs out. The return of those refugees could not depend on the consent of the Zionist invaders. The obstacle still remained, and those refugees would return as liberators, which was their inalienable right. Moving on then to Henry Katan. In fact, it was not only to their homes that the refugees should return, but to their country as well. And it was unthinkable that certain delegations of the United Nations itself could imagine that the Arab refugees might be willing to sell the country left to them by their ancestors and be offered a choice between life under Jewish domination and expropriation. Egyptian, Syrian, and Lebanese delegations offered a similar critique of paragraph 11. Behind these interventions, which also receive rare mention in the literature on Resolution 194, illuminating for the simple reason that they help to further extricate what often gets lost through a positivist and more narrow reading of paragraph 11 on the right to return. In short, for Palestinian Arab representatives, as well as for their allies in the colonized world, it appeared that return was not simply a matter of respect for individual rights. Far from it. It was from the beginning part of a much broader process of decolonization, which for the imperial powers in the United Nations was a step too far. A second aspect that is lost, and here I am entering more into the arena of speculation, is that by agreeing to paragraph 11 in separate voting in the first committee, Arab states voted against Resolution 194 in the plenary. Palestinian and Arab representatives may have been hoping to secure the decolonization of Palestine through the tools offered to them by the liberal order, namely the individual right to return. Now, this was surely a considerable risk, for the ability to do so would always depend on foregrounding the settler colonial essence of the struggle and maintaining constant vigilance against being completely subsumed by the liberal order. In conclusion, my aim here is not to diminish the importance of the legal implications of paragraph 11 on the right to return, nor the significant body of juridical research on the resolution. The point, rather, is that the right to return is not simply a question of individual rights. Reading the drafting history of paragraph 11 from a political perspective arguably reveals how the right to return has always been at the center of the struggle for decolonization. Foregrounding indigenous Palestinian voices, drawing from a broader canon of non-Western sources, and learning with and from the struggles of other colonized peoples arguably helps to shine a brighter light on and recenter what is at the root of and implicit in what has become known as the question of Palestine. And that is the underlying structure of race. After all, Palestine only became a question when it became a target of Zionist settler colonization. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Terry, for that really informative and comprehensive input. So much there that I never knew, and like you said, is it intentionally being left out when we talk about Palestinians' right to return. We're going to move on now to question and answers. We have an audience watching virtually, and we've had some questions submitted, and we're going to put those questions to all of our speakers, or anyone who feels they have an input. Please do let me know. So the first question that we have is, what can people who are watching this right now do to mobilize for the Palestinian right to return? Salman, would you like to take that one?
Yes, it's open to everybody, but I can. Yes, of course. I think it is duty of every person of conscience to speak up, especially in Europe. In Europe, there are two currents which are not the same. The people, especially those who are informed about the facts, are definitely in support of Palestinians, and those in the government, as we have seen in the Dutch case this week, bend the law and allow the war criminal to walk free. They say this is a state interest, and I don't know what state interest means if it really breaks justice into pieces. Now, ordinary people, as we know, many of them in the societies and groups everywhere, have the right and have the ability to speak to their MPs, to write to newspapers, to tell them, look, we are in the 21st century. How can you fail to see the facts which are readily available on the net, in the media, and everywhere? Let them speak up and say this injustice must stop. People must not remain hostages to the Israeli occupation. It's not only occupation, it's really ethnic cleansing. So they must speak up. They must say to their government in the democratic countries, do you represent us or you represent some other interest? If you represent us, we reject all this injustice which happens, which goes on daily in Palestine. Why should there be the biggest concentration camp in the world today in operation? Why should the constraints on it are increasing every day? As I mentioned earlier on, F-16 flies over our heads at night and sometimes in the daytime. And when we have something to do in a government, they say we have to evacuate the offices. The Israelis are going to attack us by air any moment. Children in Gaza, about 30 or 40%, have psychological problems. They have fear of this noise, humming noise, day and night, over the skies of Palestine. Where could this happen? Try this to be in London, for example, one night when there is enemy planes and drones fly over London, day and night. How could the world, Western world, or civilized world, if there is such a word, remain silent? So every human beings have a right and duty to do something, and they should do that.
Thank you.
I'll add a word or two if I may.
Absolutely.
I think first of all, of course, I could thank Dr. Salman for mentioning Gaza and reminding everybody of Gaza and the connection here. I think it's important to bring all of Palestine back into the conversation. What is happening today, even among activists, even among pro-Palestinian organizations, the discourse on Palestine is limited to the West Bank, maybe East Jerusalem, and from time to time, the discourse goes on to Gaza when there's an attack on Gaza. And it's only within the confines that the Zionists allow, that the Zionists have created. What we saw in May, I was in Palestine in May during the uprising, and what we saw in Lid, what we saw in Bir Saba, where Dr. Salman is from the Naqab, what we saw in Nasra, of course, in Jerusalem, and throughout all of Palestine, is that these confines are artificial. Palestinians have broke through these artificial boundaries, and there was one Palestine. We cannot talk about Palestine without talking about the concentration camp of Gaza. We cannot talk about Palestine without the horrendous treatment of the Palestinian Bedouin in the Naqab. where thousands of homes are being destroyed every day, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinian citizens of Israel, so-called citizens, I should say, still live without access to water and electricity and roads and medical care and so on. Of course, we cannot talk about Palestine without talking about what's happening in Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem, and so on, and Lid, and so forth. We have to talk about all of it. We have to bring all of Palestine into this, and then we have to also make sure that Resolution 194, with the details, and by the way, those those are exactly the kinds of details that we heard, that people need to be familiar with this. We bring it all in, and then we demand our elected officials or non-elected officials in countries where representatives are not elected, that the conversation has got to change. If anybody wants to be elected here in the United States, for example, for school board, for city council, obviously for state, local government and national government, they're all invited to junkets by the Zionists. They are all bombarded with information. They're all bombarded and wined and dined by the Zionists. It has to be made absolutely clear that what Dr. Salman said earlier, Zionism must be abolished. There should be zero tolerance. As Dr. Radakarmi says, there should be zero tolerance to Zionism. A politician, any person running for office who associates themselves with Zionism must know that they are associating themselves with racism and violence, and they may as well be associating themselves with the Ku Klux Klan or any other supremacist, fascist organization. Zionism has to be clearly placed in the same column as all other racist, fascist, violent ideologies. And no more should Zionists feel that they have a seat at the table. No more should they feel like they are buddies with everybody else and they get to negotiate and they get to call the shots. And politicians have to know that if they don't denounce Zionism, they will not be elected. If they do not denounce Zionism, they will lose their job and they will be shamed. If not today, tomorrow. That's the reality. And this is something that we can do, especially if you're living in Europe, in Western Europe or North America. These are things that we can do because we have access to elected officials. We have that access. And so the kind of organizing that I mentioned earlier in my remarks is precisely that. Make it absolutely clear to every elected official from school board all the way up to national office that associating themselves with Zionism is absolutely unacceptable. And then we take it from there and we bring back the conversation to where it needs to be. The conversation of Palestine needs to be determined by the rights of Palestinians, by the boundaries of historic Palestine, not by what the Zionists feel comfortable with.
Thank you. Terry, do you have anything to add on what can people do to mobilize for the right of Palestinians' right to return? Oh, I think you're on mute, Terry. Can't hear you.
No, I would just reiterate the importance of this point on bringing the whole of Palestine back into the picture. And in talking about refugees, I think that means also bringing back into conversation the displacement of Palestinians in the shadows of the wars of 1948 and 1967. Seeing this process of an ongoing Nakba is critical to understanding Zionism and what has happened in Palestine. And that's an education process too, of bringing those stories back into a dialogue with the refugees from the 1948 and 1967 wars. I think that's a critical part of education, because it's only, I think, in looking, I refer to it as using some other terms, drawing from other research, the shadows of the two wars. It's only in looking into the shadows, I think, that one can begin to see that underlying structure. Whereas if you just focus solely on the months and years of the two wars, you don't have as clear a picture of that underlying structure of race and how that has contributed to, I think it was to turning, to use another terms of others again, turning Palestine inside out.
Sure. And just following on from this, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on, for all of our speakers, on the Palestinians' political leadership and the discourse and change of that over the decades, and its relationship to Palestinians' right to return. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Salman, should we start with you?
Yes. Well, this is the current Palestinian campaign, especially in 1993. At the moment, Palestinians are about 14 million people. Half of them are on Palestine soil. And unfortunately, regrettably, they have no trust in so-called official leadership, especially after Oslo. Oslo is, to the Palestinian case, is worse than Balfour Declaration. It's a disaster. And we knew that. Edward Said wrote about this 1 month in 1993, in October 1993, after the signing of that so-called agreement. Now we know this is the case. What resulted after that is that many Palestinians, including Edward Said, Haider Abdel Shafi, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, and so on, Sharif, Shafiq al-Hout, and others, and myself, held so many conferences in the last 25 years, demanding a simple right. That is, we need new elections in which a new Palestinian National Council should be elected. This is now more pressing than ever because 70% of Palestinians are young people. Half all the Palestinians are born after Oslo, and they have 50 or 60 years to live, and they have no say about their future. And this is, of course, I cannot use very strong words, but this is unacceptable. And so now the current trend or the movement among Palestinians of every color and shape everywhere is that they're calling for new elections for Palestinian National Council. Who is opposing that? We know those opposing that are the enemies of Palestine. And who are the enemies of Palestine? Of course, United States and Israel, some Arab governments who are becoming allied with that group, and of course, invested interest in Ramallah to keep things that they are because they have power and they have no trust by the people, but they are kept by the funds paid by the United States to pay for salaries 40,000 soldiers in order to protect Israel from their own people, and by the European Union, who keep them just alive. Let me just add one thing I saw in Gaza about European Union. I see many examples of aid they give into health and education and so on, but they are giving them like after a great bombardment and destruction of Palestinian homes and people and so on, they give them enough like Band-Aid. And so that they say that we are helping you just to keep them alive, but to keep them slaves and to keep them under the Israeli thumb. The answer, the easy answer, the logical answer, the just answer is to stop the criminal from committing his crime, not to go to the injured and give them Band-Aid, and not to go to the injured and give them a little shelter until the next bombardment. So it is absolutely in line what the Israelis are doing. Let them keep them, distract them every day, and just keep them on the level of living. If they have any sense of justice, they will go to the criminal and say, stop your crime, and we are not going to come after you and sweep the rubble and give people some food to eat. This is a crime. This is assisting the crime. And an example, as I just said before, Ismail Zaida, who is a Palestinian, but he's a Dutch citizen, his family has been killed during the attack in 2014. And General Gantz is totally responsible. The court said he has impunity. He has state immunity. So it is amazing that Europe could accept that and keep all these crimes going on without remedy for the crimes. They should stop the origin of the crime. The original criminal should be like they do everywhere else. So that's the answer. That's the answer. And that comes, by the way, for group collective work by Palestinians. I say that the refugees in their camps must revolt. They say we don't want dripping aid by Western powers and by United States. We want to go home. If we go home, we are capable of living alone and taking care of ourselves. Don't give us drip like in a hospital just to stay barely alive and keep the crime going on. This is what the Palestinians should do by electing a new council. And also, all people who are on the side of Palestinians should support that move and not recognize anybody or anything else.
I'll jump in if I may, just for a moment, and then I apologize, but I have to run.
Sure.
You know, it's interesting because whenever the issue of the so-called of Palestinian leadership is brought up, there are two things that always come up. One is the fact that there is the factions, Hamas and Fatah, and the rift between Hamas and Fatah. And the second thing is that Palestinians are not united, Palestinians are fragmented, Palestinians have no leadership. These are things that come up even among Palestinians, even in Palestinian organizations, Palestinian conferences. This is kind of the lion's share of the conversation is on these two things. And I will add just something to that. Number one, Fatah and Hamas do not represent all of Palestinian political life.
Correct.
Fatah and Hamas are two small groups who exist in a very limited part of Palestine. And so it's important to, first of all, legitimize all Palestinian voices, all Palestinian political voices, number one. Number two, expand, go out of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Listen to the Palestinians in the Naqab. I know wonderful, brilliant young leaders, younger and older, but mostly younger leaders who live and do incredible work in the Naqab for the Palestinian Bedouin who live there. The same goes for Jerusalem. The same goes for, throughout all of Palestine. Fidash Hadeh from Lid, who came to prominence, she's a city council member, who was heroic in during the uprising in May and so forth. So we need to expand and stop talking about just those two things. And number two, from my experience, from the people that I talk to, and I'm in Palestine, quite a lot. I was there in May, I was there in July, I'll be there again soon. The local Palestinian leadership, again, the Palestinian Authority should not be considered as Palestinian leadership. It's not Palestinian leadership. They represent no one. They have very little authority and legitimacy, in my view. But the Palestinian leadership, the people who are on the ground, who do incredible work, again, from the Naqab all the way up to the Galilee, from Jerusalem from in the Jordan River Valley all the way to Jaffa and Lid and so on, and Ramle. They do incredible work. They are united. They speak with one voice. Everybody speaks about a single Palestine, a single free Palestine. Everybody wants their kids to be able to go to the beach, and if they want to pray in Al-Aqsa, they want to be able to pray in Al-Aqsa. And if they want to marry somebody, if they live in the Naqab and they want to marry somebody in Hebron, they want to be able to do that and live together wherever they choose. And they don't want all these limitations. They all speak with a single voice. The problem is that they can't work together because it is between the Israeli secret police and the Palestinian Mukhabarat, the Palestinian secret police. They can't work. Every time you try to get somebody from Bir Sabah and somebody from Hebron, Al Khalil, to meet, on the way they will be arrested, either by the Palestinian secret police or by the Israeli intelligence services. They will not allow it to happen. And of course, you can't keep a secret in Palestine because there's no secret, it's impossible. So the reality is that, number one, what is called leadership today is not the leadership. Number two, the leadership that does exist cannot function as leadership because of the limitations imposed by the Palestinian Authority and by the employer of the Palestinian Authority, which is of course the state of Israel. And number three, there is a unified voice. There is a voice calling for a single democracy, a free Palestine, from the river to the sea, from Ras al-Naqura to Rash to the Gulf of Aqaba. There is a single Palestine that is recognized by the people who live there. And that is the Palestine that we should be discussing. And these are the people that we should be talking about. And these are the people that we should be supporting. And these are the people that we should be recognizing and inviting to speak when we have, when we talk about Palestine. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. I really apologize, but I have to run. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. I too, it's for me, it's almost midnight, and I have to rise early.
Of course.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and nice to see my good friend Terry and to hear good work and good word by Miko, and thank you for arranging all this, and I hope you have a recording of it sometime.
Absolutely, we will. Thank you so much. Take care.
So, thank you very much. I have to sleep a little before I start my work tomorrow morning. I'm working on Saturday. So take care. Take care.
All the best. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Terry, I don't know if you had any input to, I know you the last point around the political discourse on the right of return for Palestinians.
No, I think I would defer to some of my good friend Salman on the points that he made. Although I would perhaps offer just a note from the perspective of research on Palestinian refugees and the discourse. I think the question related to a change in discourse at the level of political leadership with the launch of negotiations between the PLO and Israel in the 1990s. And it brought back to me Edward Said's piece, Permission to Narrate, where he makes the point that he's writing in the mid-1980s after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. And he says, never has so much been written about Palestinians, and he's referring to material written in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And he says, the Palestinians are there, all right, but the narrative is not. And for me, I think that period, the 1980s, moving to the end of the 1980s and 1990s, is really critical in understanding how the Palestinian refugee issue has since been framed and how the right of return has been framed. In the sense that much of that early and brilliant work that addressed the underlying structure of settler colonialism, it hasn't been totally absent since the 1990s, and indeed in the last decade or so has seen a real resurgent in interest among scholars and also as a political discourse. And I think the challenge from an academic or a scholarly, from a research perspective, is on the one hand is that act and process of recovering and recentering that early work, but on the second hand, in terms of thinking strategically about advancing, moving towards the right of return as practice. Much of the work that has been done on the Palestinian refugee regime, and here I refer to, of course, UNRWA and also the UNCCCP, and also international diplomacy on Palestinian refugees. Much of that work has been done in the last 20, 30 odd years since the launch of political negotiations between the PLO, Israel, and has been shaped, I think, very much by the frame of reference that the quote-unquote Middle East peace process provided. And so I think in that sense, the real challenge also, in addition to recovering and recentering that early research by Palestinian Arab and other scholars that deals with the underlying structure of settler colonialism and race, that explains not only the Nakba of 1948, but the displacement that had already begun well before 1948, continued after, carried through the 1967 war, and continues until today throughout all areas of historic Palestine. It's critical to recenter, I think, and bring race into how we understand international humanitarian interventions in Palestine and international diplomacy. And just to end on one quick thinking about that practically, something that I've begun to rethink, for example, is how Canada's experience as and history and present as a settler colonial country, for example, how did that influence Canada's role in shepherding 181 through the General Assembly? Canada played a significant role in that process. Canada played a significant role in the drafting of 194 and was an early proponent of this idea that somehow refugees should be more realistic about their future, i.e., that they would be better for them if they chose to be resettled in Arab host states and elsewhere. It was during this time that Canada was making these arguments, not long after Resolution 194, and Canada voted for Resolution 194. Not long afterwards, Canada was saying, well, it's probably better that refugees be resettled elsewhere. It was during the same period that Canada was also continuing to carry out forced removals of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I think we need to begin to understand these connections across different experiences and bring those back into the history and present of Palestinian refugees and the right of return, not just in terms of displacement and the denial of return, but also how the international community has responded, whether through humanitarian assistance or through international diplomacy.
Absolutely. Yeah, such an important point to finish on. And actually, as you were speaking earlier, I was reflecting a lot on my country, Ireland, and our occupation of Britain over the decades, and how this movement to decolonize our minds in a way as well, and look at our positionality and our solidarity with struggles around the world. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Terry. It's been really great to speak with you this evening. And I'm sure our audience will agree that we've learned a lot. And thanks as well to our other speakers. Just to say thank you all for watching. The all of Return Week events have been recorded and are on Palestine Return Centre's Facebook and YouTube page. If you missed any of them, you're welcome and encouraged to go back and watch. There's been some phenomenal speakers this week, and some very clear messages coming out on the Palestinians' right to return and how we can all join forces in that fight for peace, justice, freedom, and self determination of the Palestinian people. So, thank you very much for tuning in, and be well. All the best.